Should we get started?
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us. Welcome to our attendees and to our panelists. We appreciate you all being on today. Wanted to give a quick overview of what we're planning to talk about. Very exciting discussion about the human side of developing AI. So to give everyone an overview of what we're planning behind AI is a critical and often overlooked process that many of you are familiar with, and definitely our panelists will dive into the details today about data labeling. It's a meticulous task that's performed by countless unseen humans across the globe, and it primarily involves tagging raw data like images, audio clips, text, with informative labels, and it turns it into a signal that the AI can understand and then learn from. This human touch in AI data annotation isn't just a step in the process. It's actually the foundation upon which many AI models, or all AI models, are built to make them accurate and effective for their use case and the purpose that they are serving. This is meticulous in the process and the delivery methodology, and it involves raw data tagging that allows for example, a picture of a car to be recognized by your Tesla that you're driving around so that the Tesla doesn't hit the car. Or as another example, an audio clip of a call where the speakers are being tagged. If it's a customer service call, the speaker who is the customer is being tagged, what they're saying and their topics, and then the agent is being tagged as well. So that then when you use a chatbot, you're training it to have a conversation. It knows what to expect from customers from this huge data set that has been fed into the training, and then it also knows how it should respond. It also affects speech recognition systems like your in-home speakers and those speakers on your cell phone that you're talking to. So today, our panel of experts are discussing the indispensable role of humans in that process and how they contribute to developing the algorithms that are shaping our future. So welcome. WeLoad Data is sponsoring this webinar, and WeLoad Data is the methodology or the path for those humans to provide training data to many large tech companies and startups and all different kinds of companies all over the world. Including annotation, collection of data, generation of data, content curation, relevance, prompt engineering, all that interesting stuff that's feeding those LLMs that you're talking to now over the past year and a half. And Michaela Grace and Björk Larson have joined us today. Michaela, you want to give an intro?
Yes, hi. So I'm Michaela. I am the head of AI and ML engineering here at WeLoad, so leading a team of data engineers and machine learning engineers to help solve some of the problem and augment our workflows with AI better.
Yeah, thank you. And Björk?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Burke Larson, I'm the head of enterprise operations here at WeLoad Data. So that kind of key that Sarah was talking about, combining what our clients want to the folks doing the annotations, making sure that all runs smoothly, the nitty-gritty operations details, connecting the dots. That's what I'm in charge of, and trying to get done for all of our delighted customers every day.
Awesome. Thank you both. Again, thank you for joining us to have this conversation. So wanted to talk about the market growth that we've seen. So I mentioned, and everybody knows, that LLMs kind of changed the world in, I think, in October, November of 2022. And we have shifted, many companies and people have shifted how we interact with AI applications on a daily basis. And then companies have shifted their focus, their investment, their thought, and their sort of brain power towards how they can implement AI. So that's it led to an increase in the demand for skilled annotators. So, Michaela, I wonder if you could tell us, what are the factors that are driving that growth in the market?
Yeah, great question. I think that from the business side, it has become exceedingly clear that having very performant AI is a huge strategic advantage, right? And that's become sort of public knowledge. And then from the practitioner side, those who are building these AI systems, it remains true, as it has been for years, that having very, very high quality data, which accurately reflects the kinds of outputs you want your model to give, is fundamental. So, there's only so far, especially in the world of these LLMs, that can and are expected to answer really specialized tasks, to be experts on certain things. You cannot reach that level of performance with just scraping or with crowdsourcing, right? You really need to have data that reflects the kind of quality that you would like your model to output. And so more than ever, I think folks are investing in their data sets and in their data labeling.
Okay. And then, Birk, how is it evolving to support that need?
Yeah, so what we saw in the past, right, was a need for people that spoke a language, right? So native speakers that just understood and could do the translation, localization type work. In there, you probably also wanted some cultural competency, right? I'm originally from Iceland, but I've lived in the States for 30 years. If you were to tell me to try to, hey, what's going on in Iceland today? Probably not the best bet, even though I would qualify as a native speaker and can speak the language and, watch the news and everything and have a conversation. Just, you want that cultural competency component and the today's culture, right? What's happening today, because that evolved really quickly sometimes. So what that started was just native speaker, basic skills, can read, write, and provide some feedback, right? That is really evolving into experts, and that have domain knowledge, right? To Michaela's point, you really want accurate data to train your models. And so, now you're moving beyond just like the simple example you provided for cars, right? Is this a vehicle in a picture, or is it a pedestrian or a bike or something else, right? That kind of basic tagging has now evolved into, okay, we need to understand something with a cultural component and domain knowledge. Like, let's talk about chemistry, or talk about coding experience, or talk about creative writing, prompt generation, output response, things like that. You're going to need more skills than just kind of a basic understanding. The basic understanding stuff is still needed, don't get me wrong. We've all played around with various LLMs and seen hallucinatory output or things that aren't quite right. So that stuff still needs to be fixed. But overall, yeah, there's definitely an evolution forward away from just kind of the native speaker basics.
Right. And there's still some subjectivity to that expertise, right? That makes it a bit complicated. So asking what the most important part of a car is that makes it go, right? That could still be, a mechanic can have a different opinion, and you could start having an argument between two mechanics in a room. So there's the importance of getting a wide variety of experts as well, and not just relying on a small data set in that sense.
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, if you showed me a picture of ultrasounds, like as a lay person, I would have no idea. It's like I might be able to identify a hand or a foot or, something very specific. But, show that to one ultrasound tech, they'll know a lot more. Show it to 10, and you're getting that consensus in that domain expertise, right? And so it is definitely narrowing, getting deeper and deeper into specific fields that you're looking for.
And also,
go ahead. Sorry, Michaela.
No, yeah, I think that subjectivity is an opportunity for differentiation between these models, right? So maybe you want a model that has a more direct tone, right? And then you instruct your data labelers to give outputs like that so that you train the model to have a direct tone. Or you want the model to behave in a, they talk sometimes about the preachiness of AI models. Like, what's the response that the AI gives when you ask it to do something that it is not allowed to do? So I think, the tone of refusals, the tone of the outputs, that's something that working with a trusted data partner to really be clear about, well, in the realm of subjectivity, what kinds of outputs do we want? And being able to define that really clearly and get a data set that reflects, from the business side, your personal, or, the business's personal preferences in the gray areas.
Right. That is interesting too. I always find that interesting for in age brackets, right? If you want an LLM is going to respond to kids, then it may need to have a completely different tone. Maybe it's depending on what age the kids are. With teens, you may want it to be very direct, and with little kids, you want it to be very bubbly. And then with adults, it needs to be completely different. So there's elements too that can be maybe not just the business output, but the actual user profile and how it responds to the user as well. Okay, well, then that actually is an interesting point around what types of opportunities this is then presenting for people who are looking to enter this field. So, Birk, you mentioned the need for expertise. do you see any changes in how we've evolved as we're bringing in annotators into our space and working for our customers?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the past, right, we were looking for annotators to do work, and we didn't value necessarily the other skills that they could bring to the table. So again, if you had like a creative writing degree, you knew chemistry, you knew coding, all of that. If you were just annotating, pixels on a photo of cars, like that wasn't taken into account, right? There was no opportunity to necessarily show off that skill set as an annotator. Now, with the different domain expertise that's being requested, that various firms are looking for, now we can actually start honing in and also valuing that, right? Maybe the basic annotations were they're less costly, right? Less expensive. Now, if you're really looking for expert domain knowledge, take the ultrasound example, right? You're going to need to get a higher skilled person that has that knowledge that can then get paid for applying that knowledge directly. So I think there's definitely an evolution in what we're looking for in the different domains, the level of expertise, the level of consensus we're going to be able to find across that expert range, right? Once you get to the bleeding edge, there are often different opinions on what is right, what is the correct method. And so trying to get to that point, we're going to need to value things differently. So that definitely provides a different career path progression potentially for annotators than was previously available.
Mm-hmm. I think too, Michaela, you may be, sorry, I didn't want to jump in, but because I did have another question for you, but I think you'll also see, or we're seeing right from our customers, not clearly credentialed requirements. So people who are great at something, like how do you define somebody who's great at styling clothes, right? Yes, there are fashion degrees and there's elements of that, or somebody who's great at get ready with me or building content that people want to watch and on YouTube. So those types of things are still really interesting, and those skill sets are still needed to help train these models that aren't necessarily a specific degree that you would have or a background or something that could be credentialed. So I think it's kind of interesting that it's expanded the need for different capabilities. As you mentioned, they were not necessarily thought of before. We were looking at coders and they were still working in general pools. But now we need coders and we need biologists, but we also need people who are makeup artists and and various skill sets and interesting interests and hobbies and dog trainers and things like that that are also training all of our LLMs and all of our AI tools as well. Michaela, was there anything that you think in terms of what is crucial about these different skill sets and about these opportunities and these individuals that is required for accuracy in AI systems?
Yes, I mean, I think that there's having the individuals who have these skill sets as labelers, and then there's ensuring sort of performance and alignment throughout different projects, right? So having a really strong apparatus to make sure that a labeler who is a lawyer and is working on legal briefs is also labeling in alignment with the client's needs, right? And with the guidelines and with the needs for this particular model. And so, I think it's hiring top talent and making sure that we have really, really good annotators, and then making sure that those annotators are supported through the process, that they know what they're meant to be doing, that they have really good training and resources.
Is there a difference between that, or maybe you could describe for us the difference between scraping then and how that would impact the model versus trained annotation? Has there been any recent research on that, or kind of the evolution of the LLMs using the full internet as their training data pool versus when you have that very tight guideline driven training for the accuracy?
Yeah, scraping and crowdsourcing kind of has an inherent ceiling. And in fact, if you just train on the raw internet without any filtering, you won't like what you get, I have to say. So there's space and a need for, a huge volume of words scraped from the internet, a huge sort of fundamental base knowledge. But if you want to have high performance on specific tasks, I keep using, legal, math, coding, you can't get that from the general public. Like I couldn't give you any good legal content, and so you couldn't expect the sort of like collective consensus to do that without adding in annotation that is very much tailored to specific types of knowledge and expertise and outputs.
Okay. And then those types of outputs that those trainers are, those annotators are doing. Björk, what types of skills are you seeing in the workforce that are most valuable for those data annotators?
Yeah, so fundamentally, an annotator needs to have really strong critical thinking skills, problem-solving skills, attention to detail. A lot of the questions, the things that we're annotating is not as simple anymore as like, is this a picture of a dog or not, right? Is this a car or not? It's getting much more complex, especially in those domain expertise fields where you might be writing really tricky prompts to try to educate an LLM on something, in providing input from your expert domain. And so I think, understanding the guidelines is always important to maintain high quality. To Michaela's point earlier, right? Like the quality is key on training your model. However, there's always going to be edge cases. There's always going to be a little bit of that wiggle room or gray space of like, does this fit this version or that version? And then being able to kind of apply the guidelines to those cases the best you can with critical thinking and logic is really key. So understanding, being able to reading comprehension is still a key. Being able to just see what the ask is and be able to provide an output that, without having to reread or redo things a lot. Speed is still key. I keep for costs and everything, right, that we're trying to deliver. I think to some extent you could talk more about like numerical skills or visualization skills sometimes are helpful, but increasingly, especially with prompts, creative writing. Can you express yourself in a creative manner succinctly, right, to be able to put something down that expresses or captures what you're looking for quickly, not be too verbose, etc. So those are the types of skills that I think have always been valuable, but even more so now with a domain expertise layered on top.
Okay. And then once we have that trained data set, and then we have done training for those annotators, once we have trained those annotators in order to build the data set, can you share an example of how that training data set has built by humans has improved an AI system?
Yeah.
Like a sort of an educational across the board example, of course, not one of our customers.
Of course, yeah. Yes, I used to work on speech recognition many, many years ago. I worked at Google, but the example I'll give is very general, sort of in the field of speech recognition. But I think that, for example, accents, speech recognition in English and the recognition of different accents, right? If you train a speech recognition model on only human, speech that comes from US English speakers, and then you try to use that model on anyone from Australia or Ireland, it will not, the accuracy will be severely degraded. And so in that case, right, it's very, very clear throughout, all of speech recognition and the research that we did a few years ago, that having really, really strong data sets that span a large set of accents so that you have coverage from various regions of various countries and from non-native English speakers who have accents that are, quite varied. Making sure that you have a large, diverse data set ensures that all of your customers receive sort of similarly high performance, and that you don't have the specific subset represented in the data, and then the rest of the sort of real world doesn't receive that same performance.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I know sometimes I have a Southern accent that really comes out and it won't understand what I'm saying. So,
there's huge phonetic variance between these. Even, I grew up in Kansas, so like if I sound like this, right, versus speaking like someone from the Northeast, those are entirely different phonetic sets and entirely different inputs. And you need to make sure that you have really good regional coverage for every country that you're working in to ensure that you can get good performance across users.
Yeah, and it's also really interesting when you transcribe, I know, because we're doing some large data sets in all different languages, and transcribing that accent in so that it can then understand that, right? So trying to think of a good example, but yeah, Boston, the way you'd say a word in Boston versus the way you'd say it in Texas might be transliterated very differently. And so you also have to have those guidelines and those orthographies defined as well for people to be able to tie to and to refer to. So I know we do quite a lot of work with building out those guidelines and the recommendations to make sure we cover those. So having the trainers and the people at the wide data set, but then also being able to capture the nuance of what they bring to the table. So then
it goes right to your point of not scraping the internet, right? Because the internet's not going to have all of these nuances and can't, build the guidelines around capturing that so that it can be fed into the model correctly, so the model learns correctly. If you just scrape everything possible, you exactly to Michaela's point, you're not going to like what you get, and it's probably not going to work.
And it's not going to know necessarily because it won't be labeled. So it won't know this is an Irish accent versus a Texas accent versus a Boston accent and of all these different types of English. So it wouldn't even, it would just muddle. Does it kind of fuse together, Michaela? Is that typically how it would go? And it would think of English as one muddled.
I mean, there's various ways. There have been many papers on various ways to address the different accents, whether you want to tell it what accent it's getting based upon, some input that's something that about the user or not. There we published a little bit of research on that actually eons ago. Yeah. So, but ultimately you can't, whether or not you're telling it, the model, it has this accent or not, it needs to fundamentally have learned to recognize those accents, right? It needs to have seen enough data from every accent to be able to recognize that and have learned, and it's updated its weights, right? Its neurons to recognize those accents. And so regardless, having sort of a minimum amount, the basic minimum amount at least, right, to make sure that you have good coverage for within the data set is crucial. There's no way to get around it, right? There's no way to fake having a good data set.
Okay. On that note then, if we think about synthetic data, could you kind of give a brief overview of how synthetic data is created, why it would be useful, where it's used for anybody who's unfamiliar from this, and then kind of how that deviates from human data and what the limitations are of synthetic versus human created or annotated data?
Yeah, great segue, because synthetic data seems like a very appealing proposition in some cases where it's like, oh, maybe we can generate this much faster and much more cheaply. But there was a really good paper recently, actually, last few months out of Cambridge and Oxford, which is called The Curse of Recursion, where they did research on, well, can I ask my LLM to train my LLM, right? Can I use the LLM to generate a data set that then I use to continue to train? And they found that very quickly, as you go through that cycle and you say, well, generate data, retrain, generate data, retrain, there's something called model collapse. I don't know if they coined that term, but that's what they use. So the idea that it's very degenerative. As you retrain the model on just synthetic data, the underlying distribution that it's learned drifts away from actual human speech, and you end up with outputs or human generated text. And you end up with a model that is severely degraded, right? Putting out outputs that don't make a lot of sense, that aren't very clear. And so they really, in that case, proved that just using synthetic data without a human in the loop to relabel the data and make sure that the data is aligned with human preferences is not something that works at this point for LLMs. One caveat, though, not to only hate on synthetic data. Synthetic data is useful for augmentation sometimes, right? So classic example of this is if you have speech recognition and you have a sort of small data set and you want to augment that data set and try to just generate more examples. One thing that is really effective is noisification. So you take all those examples and you add different types of background noise, cars honking, people talking, white noise, to those utterances, to those sort of pieces of text. And so that kind of data augmentation with synthetic data can be really, really helpful, but purely synthetic data sets without any human input are rarely sufficient.
Okay. And then how does that human annotation then help in the complex data sets, right? So Michaela gave great examples of maybe simpler data, right? Like the noise in the background or kids crying or whatever it is that's going to layer in. It creates a more complex data set, but how else would human annotation help in that understanding of the complexity?
Yeah, so this is where humans are key to the process, right? That the model doesn't learn necessarily, and to Mikhail's point, it degrades, in fact. Versus, take our accents example, right? If I were to sit an annotator down and have them listen to audio from people from all over the world speaking English, they would very, very likely be able to understand what the person is saying, whether they were speaking in a Scandinavian accent, like my family does, Chinese, Indian, African, anything, right? They're all speaking English, and the annotator will be able to understand that. Versus a model, if you haven't fed it all that information and trained it, it's not going to know what's going on, right? And so it'll misrepresent things or not understand, not be able to produce the output. So this is still where humans have, they have context and nuance, and they put together all of their lifelong learnings into something as basic as understanding a person from anywhere in the world speaking English, right? That's something that just isn't necessarily possible with every model. And so that's where humans are still, a linchpin to make sure that the data that's being fed into these systems is accurate, is of quality, will make the model better, right? And so I think that's something that you definitely can't generate with synthetic data right now. The augments are great, and I think that can, expand data sets and help deal with like bumps in the road, but it isn't, enough to, when you're taking a left turn, it's not good enough.
That ties to really well, because I think we want to emphasize that humans are still necessary, but will likely always be necessary to support these training, right? Or I mean, maybe that's a question that people like to debate, and there's research being done to support that. But if we think about how quickly culture evolves, like I don't know what my kids are saying when they say these things that they're, what the slang that they're using, I have no idea what they mean half the time. And so the models would have to be trained to understand how quickly words and language evolves as well to support it, or even what's fashionable or what's cool or what's not cool when we're talking about multimodal models. So that actually brings me to a question that I really wanted to get both of your takes on: the cultural sensitivity and the cultural elements. And you talked about that at the beginning a bit, Birk. What is the importance and why is it crucial to have that cultural sensitivity in data annotation and across the wide group that we've been talking about today, and having a wide swath of different contributors with different backgrounds and expertise and hobbies and interests and all of those things? Why does that make an impact to the models as they're being built?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you're striving to make a comprehensive model that is fit for any human in the world, right, then it needs to have a lot of nuance and be able to understand like where you're coming from to kind of meet you where you are. I think that if we build models only on, to Michaela's point, like only speakers from Kansas, like you're going to get a very different output than what you would if you were doing it worldwide. If you were to say, put this in the bin here in the United States, you might mean, okay, do you want to recycle something, or is there a container to put things in? Versus you say that in the UK, and it's like, throw that away in the trash, in the garbage, in the rubbish, right? So if you have a model that's going to generate output that just says, put that in the bin, that might make perfect sense in the UK. And here we'd be like, what does the model mean when it says that? If you don't have that nuance, if you haven't baked that in, and the model detects someone in the UK is asking this question, that might be an appropriate response there and completely illogical elsewhere. And that's just with English that, you think should be relatively easy and straightforward, and you find out that it really isn't, right? And so you need to train the model really well and have that diversity of viewpoints to make a more robust, well-rounded product, but then also bake in that nuance. If you want it to be truly global, Michaela also mentioned earlier, like, is there a persona that you want the model to assume? Is it more authoritative, or is it more friendly, or is it, whatever suggestions? Is it really hip? Has it been trained, Sarah, on all the teen lingo that's happening right now that I would have no clue on what the model would?
I'm glad you wouldn't either. You and I both.
Hopeless. So, I think if you scraped all of TikTok, potentially, right? All of the content being generated there by, I'm assuming, mostly people younger than me. They're going to have a different vernacular, a different, they that's just how culture is, how it evolves. And you're going to
Mhm.
find those little niches in many spots across many facets of society. And so being able to build a model that understands that kind of nuance and is able to produce output is really key. It also depends. Are you going for a very general model or something very specific?
And then, but you mentioned, and Michaela, we were talking the other day about the continuous loop of feedback. So with that cultural evolution, you need to continuously retrain the model, right? So it's not a one and done.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, new concepts enter culture all the time, and so you can't take a static data set from, for example, you take a data set from 2021 and it doesn't know what an LLM is, right? Or it doesn't know the sort of cultural importance. So you certainly, for news, culturally relevant things, topics that change over time, updating the data set. You don't have to generate everything from scratch because obviously, linear algebra stays linear algebra more or less. But cultural sensitivity is certainly sort of a moving target, if that makes sense.
Yeah, hard to solve for, but that's where the human element comes in. But then, what steps on top of that could companies implement in their data annotation process to make sure that they are culturally sensitive, or allowing for the model to be culturally sensitive rather than sort of the company being, but making sure that they can account for that. Is it based on candidates or that, are employed, or guidelines, those types of things? Either Michaela, Burke, either of you, any view on that?
Yeah, without a doubt, I think it's setting a good foundation to ensure you're capturing the right stuff from the get-go, right?
Yeah.
You want to have a solid set of guidelines that are specific enough for your use case that they make sense, but maybe not so, dictating that every last thing is accounted for. There's always that gray space, and that's where you're asking a human to make a judgment for a reason, right? If the model could just output everything for you, you just deploy the model, but it can't. And so that's where the human annotation is key. So I think setting yourself up for success from a foundational perspective, you also look at, if you want a nuanced model that has a global viewpoint or can account for all of these other factors we've discussed, you need to then go get people from across the world to be able to do that, right? If you're not putting in the effort to source people from across the world, and diversity here is key, right? To get all the different viewpoints that you would get, not just one, the Kansas viewpoint or whatever you would pick, right? You want that diversity built in.
I agree. And I think that's where a trusted data collection partner can be really helpful. Because the worst outcome is that, someone spends a bunch of money to collect a bunch of data and label it, and it turns out that their guidelines weren't as they wanted, or the data wasn't what they expected, and because the guidelines were wrong, or the structure was wrong, and then the data isn't correct. And so a trusted partner who has a lot of experience in data labeling will be able to help you as a client ensure that all your bases are covered, that the data will be usable, that the guidelines are complete, sort of, and clear. And that's where thought partnership with your data provider is really, really important.
That makes sense. And I think challenge too sometimes is understanding maybe what the end use case is, because we're often working with customers that are doing very special, nuanced, proprietary, patented projects. So we have to try to make sure we're covering all those bases with the guideline development and that collaboration, without necessarily understanding where it's feeding into in the long run. So the experience then in having done these pieces is really important to know maybe what the nuance is that's required, without having the exact details that are necessary.
Yeah. Sometimes,
Sorry,
we're looking at really high level concepts that then get broken down into a series of steps. And so you need to make sure that you have that higher level picture in mind as you develop each step, and what's going to feed from one stream to another to get that complete picture at the end. If that's not really well thought through, you can end up collecting data that doesn't help you at all, leads you astray. And so having that thought leadership and connection, right, to understand from A to Z where you're going is really key too.
All right. Well, we have a couple of questions, and I did want to actually mention to the attendees that we have a poll online for what the most important element to our attendees is for data collection and data annotation and basically all things data for a data partner. Current poll winner is data quality and accuracy. So it still stay open, and if it changes by the end of the Q&A, we'll update you. But definitely eager to hear everybody's thoughts on that, everybody who's attending here. Michaela, we have a question for you. When is it useful to use generalists versus experts in data labeling annotation? And is it better for different types of models? Is there a need for generalists in annotation still? We touched on this a little bit, but definitely want to dive into that a little bit more for the audience.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a need for generalists because if you are trying to build a model that serves the general population and you only train it on the outputs of doctors and lawyers or coders or, creative writing specialists or whoever it is, the model will not be reflective of the opinions and sort of desires for output, right? That's the preferred outputs of the general population. And so you certainly need a lot of generalists to ensure that what you're building is useful across the broad user pool. Mm-hmm. Where specialists come in is to cover the range of things that generalists can't, right? So I need, folks that are going to be able to understand culturally relevant information that's in English and Japanese together, right? Some sort of meme. Or I need folks that are going to be able to, answer questions about the law or be able to debug code. And so in that case, you start from a base of generalist training where you get a lot of data to ensure that you're sort of covering the broad population. And then you add specialists where needed to cover edges where those generalists couldn't.
All right. Birk, did you, on that topic, if we have generalists, is there any training? We have a question from the audience. Do you have any suggestions on training to get into this space and or experts? Presumably the experts training is a lot of what is being done in their credentialing process. But anything on training for either generalists or experts?
Yeah, so in general, for both, I should say, generalists and experts, it's understanding that reading comprehension piece, being able to understand the guidelines and the nuance of what is the request actually, here, to be able to apply those guidelines really well. So take the legal briefs example, right? If you take a lawyer with a lot of expert knowledge on a specific topic, and then you toss them into a tool they've never seen before and ask them to produce high level output, it might take them a minute to understand how does the tool work, what's going on, what's the flow. So it's also just familiarity, like actual training, right? Mm-hmm. Sitting in the tool, trying it out, giving practice rounds for new annotators, right? Giving focused feedback, right? One-to-one feedback. Here's what you said. Here's where we think there's an error. Not from maybe like a legal standpoint, but from just an output creation standpoint. Like, was it too verbose? Was it too succinct? Did it reference things that didn't make logical sense, perhaps, or tie things to references that aren't provided? Things like that, right? So it's about giving nuanced feedback in the expert domain, and then in the generalist domain, it's about making sure that understanding the tools, understanding the culture of, to Michaela's point, like if you're doing Japan and the US and you have some very specific content there, like, do you actually know both cultures? Are you faking it like I would if I did Iceland, right? It's not going to work. And so, we would need to understand, check for that, and then give upskilling where we can to people that, on how to do it. But at the end of the day, we're not going to be able to give somebody a law degree in a couple hours, right? That's always going to be, something that the annotators bring to the table. But there's plenty of things that we do as trusted partners to make sure that the folks are really up to par and able to deliver well and accurately quickly, right? And so there's a bunch more to training that we could do, but that's, I think, a topic for a future webinar.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, then our last question from the audience is, what are the challenges in the data labeling space that we will face in 2024 and into next year in 2025? Maybe each of you have a different perspective.
Yeah, I'll take some of that. So we're seeing this incredible increase in demand means that I think for companies who are training foundation models, there's a challenge in just getting enough volume, right? And getting enough volume from trusted partners, as we talked about, who they know are high quality. And I think that sort of scaling problem remains a challenge and will. And then I think for the labelers, for the annotators, it's being nimble because things change quickly. There's, the way that you label certain outputs might change with a different architecture, different training, optimization technique, or the importance of different types of labels may shift based upon the most recent research or the types of things. For example, we're moving more into competing on multimodal models. And so those are totally different training sets than text only and totally different annotation flows. And so I think sort of being able to be nimble at very large volume is the challenge I would foresee sort of in the next year or two.
Totally.
Yeah, and I agree. I think the folks are identifying gaps in models and wanting to remediate those. But the speed with which we can find 2,000 lawyers to reach a consensus on a topic is really challenging, right? For the domain expertise, and then also for generalist knowledge. We are sometimes faced with requests that have really steep headcount requirements to try to reach that nuanced, diverse pool of folks to give their opinion on something. And so, we have to be nimble ourselves to have different practices to reach out to very diverse groups. It's not just everyone that's, sitting on the internet all day that we need to reach out to. We need to get people that don't necessarily, aren't connected to our industry, aren't paying attention to what we're doing, right? Necessarily. And so how do we reach those folks through different methods? That's something that we're having to be nimble about as well.
Yes. And no, go ahead.
Sorry. No, go ahead.
Just, we've been building that kind of thinking into our systems, into our processes, into our tech, right? Where it's being really thoughtful about how can we do this kind of thing at scale? How can we ensure that we have processes that are robust and clear and streamlined and flexible? So I think, WILO's been very much focused on building for flexibility and scale in terms of all of our onboarding, recruiting, and labeling.
Right. And the flexibility and scale are often conflicting, right? Because you, as a need or as a business requirement. So it's a bit interesting. But I was going to say, for data annotators or anybody interested in this field and joining, the flexibility is also really important because you may have a skill set that's not needed this week, but it could be in urgent need next week. So being on top of that, and you touched on this, Björk, but also just understanding that the needs can evolve so quickly from the technology companies that we support. So we may not have anything at the moment, but could have something very quickly, and then it could pause again and wouldn't be needed again for a couple of weeks. But still, there's an opportunity to contribute to AI and the training, which is really exciting for all of us. I think it's a great way to stay involved in technology as it evolves. I think it's a wonderful workforce and opportunity for everyone. It's the kind of thing I hope my kids will do. I always say that. I want my kids to be annotators when they're old enough to need to provide annotation. Right now, nobody needs their opinions. But yes, so that's all the questions that we have. I want to thank everyone for joining us to watch today. I want to thank Michaela and Björk for joining us also to talk about the essential role that humans play in annotation. And we touched on various pieces about the growth, this explosive growth in the market for skilled annotators, the need for generalists and experts in that significant growth, and the need for human annotation to be tied to synthetic and support synthetic data as well, the need for both essentially. And then of course, my favorite topic, the cultural relevance and cultural competency that's required for all the annotations. So thank you again. And if there are any other questions, we're happy to respond to them. And we will, if we didn't get to your question, we will respond directly. in the coming days, but we're also excited to hear from anybody with any topics or other queries on the human side of AI data annotation. So thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Bye.